All right, so on Tuesday we started talking about animal behavior. And on Tuesday, what we were doing basically was just some general behaviors and specifically movement behaviors and what behavior is all about. And behavior is that ability to detect a stimulus and then respond to it, okay, and how you respond to it. So today, our focus is on instinct and learning. So we're going to talk about some different learning behaviors and give some examples. And I think this is very timely. We had a faculty meeting yesterday, and half of the faculty meeting was talking about how the brain learns. And I was like, oh, we're talking about this right now in class. Yay. So some behaviors are innate behaviors. An innate behavior is a reaction to a stimulus that you have not been exposed to before. A reaction to a stimulus that you have not been exposed to before. And this is a predictable response. We talked about an innate behavior back when we were talking about marsupials and how marsupials, when they're born, they're very tiny, they're underdeveloped, and what do? They crawl up the pouch when they're born. They crawl up the pouch, get inside the pouch, and attach themselves to a nipple, right? So this is a new thing to them. They've never been born before. This is the first time they were born, but they know innately to crawl up the pouch, get in the pouch, and attach to the nipple. An example with humans, and actually most placental mammals, that suckling motion that babies have. And that allows them to get nutrients. But they know innately that they have to suckle. They know that motion to get the nutrients out of the nipple. So one of my cats that I had a long time ago, uh, her mom quit feeding her, so she wasn't fully weaned when I got her, and that's why I ended up with her. And so I had to get the kitten milk and do it with the little washcloth, and then she'd suckle on the edge of the washcloth to get the milk off of it. And she used to like to climb up on my neck when she was a little kitten. She'd climb up on my neck and do something on my neck. I couldn't tell what she was doing. My mom came to visit, and she's like, she's suckling your neck. She was trying to get milk from my neck. Obviously, that was not successful, but we'll talk about that later. Emma.
So is it kind of like a natural instinct?
Instinct is a little bit different, so we'll talk about instincts a little bit later on, but yeah, that would be kind of our connotation of instinct usually. Yeah. All right. Some behaviors are a combination of innate and learned behaviors. So learning occurs when you continue an innate behavior and are rewarded for it. So there's a stronger connection between the two because you're rewarded for your innate behavior. So once again, going back to that suckling, if you're suckling on a nipple, if you know suckling on a nipple, you get nutrients. That's a reward. You're making a stronger connection between the two. Now, my poor little kitten, since she wasn't getting anything from suckling on my neck, she either grew out of it or realized, hey, it doesn't work this way. I need to suckle on the washcloth if I want something, if I want a reward for it. So falling kind of into this category is imprinting. Imprinting is a rapid, irreversible learning process. That occurs in a narrow time span. Usually shortly after birth. Yes, it is a rapid, irreversible learning process that occurs in a narrow time span. Usually shortly after birth. So in your reading, you'll read about this guy. You don't need to know his name. He's a pretty famous guy for his imprinting work, though. His name was Conrad Lorenz, and he got geese to imprint on him. So when the geese were first hatched, he was around them. He was the first big thing that they saw. And so they imprinted on him. They thought he was, God bless you, he was their mommy. And so they would follow him around everywhere. We'll see some examples of imprinting in the video. The story of the ugly duckling is a story of imprinting. Okay? The ugly duckling was a swan. It imprinted on the duck mommy. And so all the other ducklings looked different from him because they were ducks and he wasn't. Human babies imprint on their moms. And it isn't based so much on visual because when we're first born, our visual field is very blurry. Although I know you can't see through my eyes, it's like if I take off my glasses, you're all just a bunch of colorful blobs. Right? So that's basically what human babies see. But mom's smell, the sound of her voice, and the rough shape of her face are all things that the baby can use to imprint on mom and identify her as, that's my mom. So there are different ways that we learn. And I'm just going to pull 4 of them out. There are more that you'll read about, once again, in tonight's homework. So the definition of learning is an animal's ability to adapt behavior to new situations. An animal's ability to adapt behavior to new situations. So we'll start with habituation. Habituation is, excuse me, when a repeated stimulus causes the response to decrease. Now, once again, we're talking about behavioral responses here. So, for instance, if you have a lot of birds in your garden and you don't want them in your garden because they're eating your seeds, eating your fruit, that kind of stuff, eating your flowers, okay, so you don't want the birds in your garden. So you can go to Lowe's or someplace like that and buy a fake owl. Owls, like living owls anyway, eat little birdies. Okay? So you put that out in your garden to keep the birds away. It'll work. But if you keep the owl in the same spot, after a few days, the birds will come back. Because now it's just part of the garden. It's a repeated stimulus. It hasn't changed any. It's not a new stimulus. So what you have to do so that they have habituated to it. It's just part of the garden now, no big deal. It's not going to hurt us. We're fine. So what you have to do is you have to move the owl around. And I don't mean you have to like go out there and dance with your owl or something like that. You just need to move it around the garden into different spots every day or every couple days so that it's a new stimulus. The stimulus has changed. Now, I think on Tuesday, did we talk about adaptation in this block? About how like we can't hear the fan and the... No, I knew there was one block that I forgot to talk about it. So it must have been you guys. I'm sorry for that. So with your five senses, your senses adapt to consistent stimuli. This is not habituation, but it's a similar thing. Okay, so when we're sitting here, we're bringing in lots of stuff, lots of information in the form of our five senses. But after a while, the fan on the projector, we don't hear it anymore. Because that's not a harmful stimulus. It's continuous and it's not harmful to us. And so our bodies, and so this is an internal inside our bodies say, we don't need to respond to that stimulus. We don't need to detect that anymore because it's not going to harm us. Why should we waste the energy? So if it starts making weird noises, though, that's a change in the stimulus, and then we'll notice it. So that's the reason why, so that we call this adaptation, that's the reason why you shouldn't be able to smell your own perfume. Because if you do, that means you have way too much on, because each time you inhale, you are bringing in a new stimulus, a cloud of new stimulus. So adaptation and habituation are very similar, but habituation is a form of adaptation that is a learned behavior. Habituation is a form of adaptation that is a learned behavior. Here we go with insight. Insight learning is the most complicated form of learning. So this occurs when an animal applies something it has already learned to a new situation. have this conversation at the beginning of the year. Every year at the beginning of the year when we start taking tests and people come to me and say, well, this was on the test, but we never talked about it. Well, yes, we did talk about it, but on the test, you're asked to apply that knowledge. So that's that insight learning. Okay? So taking what you know and applying it to a new situation. So not all animals have insight, can do insight learning or have insight. Humans do, obviously, and there are other mammals that do as well. Birds do, and here's a fun one, some octopuses do. Why is octopuses? These next two are forms of associative learning. You'll find those words as we're talking about them. So with classical conditioning, I'm going to tell you what it is, and then we'll take a look at examples of it. In classical conditioning, you learn to associate a neutral stimulus with a behavior that was triggered by a different stimulus. You learn to associate a neutral stimulus with a behavior that was triggered by a different stimulus. So the most famous case of this was this guy named Pavlov and his dogs. And we use his name as an adjective to describe a Pavlovian response. And so what Pavlov did is he noticed that when he was preparing supper for his dogs, they would start slobbering. They'd start salivating in anticipation of their supper. And so what he started to do was when he would prepare supper for them, he would ring a bell at the same time. So there's our neutral stimulus. The bell's not harming the dogs, it's not helping the dogs, it's just happening at the same time he's preparing supper. And of course, because he's preparing supper, they're a little slobbery and stuff. Okay. So then, in what kind of seems mean, he would just ring the bell and not prepare supper. And what happened? Dogs get a little slobbery because they associated the neutral stimulus, the bell, with their supper. Duchenne has classically conditioned me a little bit, and maybe you as well. Fourth block, I have biomed. It's my first biomed class of the day, so that's the first time I see my seniors. But by the end of fourth block, my stomach starts grumbling. Because what's next? Lunch. So anticipation of lunch, even if I'm not hungry, my stomach starts growling towards the end of fourth block. What happens to me on Tuesdays? End of fourth block. I start growling, and oh, wait, I have to wait an hour till lunch. Okay. So that would be an example also of classical conditioning. I've learned to associate my seniors with food. operant conditioning. This is another associative behavior. This time, we use reinforcement to increase the likelihood of a specific behavior. We use reinforcement to increase the likelihood of a specific behavior. And this can be positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. So for instance, if you're trying to train your puppy to go potty outside and not inside, every time they go potty outside, you give them a treat. When they go potty inside, you don't. So they learn to associate, hey, I get a treat if I go potty outside, so that's where I'm supposed to go potty. So you're reinforcing that behavior by rewarding them. That would be a positive reinforcement. On the other hand, let's say you have a cat that likes to bite, and you want to discourage that biting behavior and encourage non-biting behavior. So every time the cat bites you, you spray it with water. Excuse me. So there's a couple of ways then to look at that. You could look at it in terms of you're discouraging biting, but the way we like to flip it, because we are reinforcing a behavior, we're reinforcing not biting. So we're putting a more positive spin on it. All right. So any questions for today? That's all our learning stuff. How are the diaries coming?